A widow moved quietly between the barn and the house. Her hands, rough and calloused from years of work, had learned the language of survival. Her two daughters, young but wise beyond their years, followed her with cautious steps, their eyes wide with the curiosity of children who had seen too much for their age. Life had grown hard after her husband's passing, leaving her to wrestle the land and raise her girls alone, but there was a strength in her that no one could measure from the outside. That evening, the sky was bruised with the first hints of nightfall when she noticed a figure staggering near the edge of the property. At first, she thought it might be one of the drifters who sometimes passed through, looking for a warm meal or a place to rest. But there was something in the way he moved, stiff, careful, almost cautious like a wild animal cornered, that told her this was no ordinary traveler. She called softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without startling. The man turned, revealing the first glimpse of his face, framed by long black hair streaked with dust and sweat. His eyes were dark and wary, scanning the barn and the open land around him. He did not speak, only nodded slightly as if acknowledging her presence and the offer of help he had not yet understood. The widow felt a quickening in her chest. Something about him seemed familiar, though she could not place it, and a sense of unease settled in the pit of her stomach. The girls whispered behind her, their small voices tense but brave. They had been taught to watch, to listen, to notice what the world might overlook, and both seemed to understand that this visitor was different. He bore the marks of someone who had known violence, who had walked long distances and survived where others would not. His clothing was torn and darkened with dust, the pattern strange to her eyes, and his bare feet left prints in the soft earth. "Mother, is he hurt?" The older daughter asked, stepping closer, her small hand brushing against her mother's arm. "Yes," the widow said, her tone calm but firm. "And he needs help, whether he asks for it or not." It was not an easy decision. The world outside their small homestead was not kind, especially to outsiders, and yet something in the way he had collapsed against the fence. A faint shiver running through his frame made her pause. She could not turn him away. She could not ignore the possibility that a life might be saved by a single act of courage. Inside the barn, she found a place for him, clearing hay and debris so he could lie down. The smell of leather, hay, and earth mingled, a scent the girls were accustomed to, but that seemed to startle him. He watched their movements carefully, his gaze never leaving them for long, as if measuring whether they were friend or threat. "Sit," she said, offering a simple nod toward the corner where blankets were stacked. "Rest here. We have water and food." He hesitated, the tension in his body coiling like a spring ready to uncoil. His eyes darted toward the door, the open plains beyond, before he slowly lowered himself to the ground. The widow moved quietly, bringing a bowl of water and a piece of bread. She handed them to him without waiting for thanks, her actions guided by instinct and habit. The girls watched from the shadows, their curiosity tempered by caution. The younger one, barely more than 7, whispered to her sister, "Do you think he's dangerous?" The older girl shook her head, her face serious. "I don't know. But he looks like he needs us more than we need to fear him." The man drank the water slowly, carefully, then broke the bread into smaller pieces. His hands were strong, scarred, and precise, revealing the kind of life that had demanded both skill and resilience. As he ate, the widow could see the tension easing just slightly from his shoulders. Yet there was still a hardness in his gaze, a sense of a life lived constantly on the edge of survival. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the quiet rustle of hay and the occasional whisper from the girls. Night fell fully, and the wind outside grew colder, carrying the distant howl of coyotes. The widow lit a lantern, the soft glow casting long shadows that danced across the barn walls. The man finally spoke, his voice low, careful, carrying a weight of unspoken experience. "Why? Help me?" he asked. The widow met his eyes steadily. "Because it's right." because someone once helped me when I had no one, and because you are here, and here matters." There was a pause, a hesitation, as if he weighed her words against a lifetime of caution and mistrust. Then, almost imperceptibly, his posture relaxed. The hard edge of his defenses did not vanish, but it softened enough for her to sense the possibility of trust forming. As the night deepened, the barn became a small world unto itself. Outside, the plains remained empty and unforgiving, but inside, there was a fragile thread of safety. The widow and her daughters moved quietly, performing small tasks, gathering more blankets, and keeping a watchful eye on their unexpected guest. It was a simple routine, but it carried the weight of survival, of careful choices that could shift the course of many lives. At some point, he began to speak more freely, fragments of his story spilling out in broken sentences. His name, unfamiliar to them, carried the cadence of a language that belonged to the land before theirs. He spoke of journeys through harsh landscapes, of battles fought quietly and decisively, of losses that weighed heavier than any physical wound. The widow listened without interruption, letting him unburden himself in a way that suggested trust might slowly take root. The girls were fascinated. They had heard stories of the Apache from travelers and books, tales of brave warriors and harsh survival. But to meet one here, so close, alive, and vulnerable, brought a new sense of awe. They did not fully understand the man or his world, yet they sensed the honor and courage that lay beneath his weariness. As the first light of dawn brushed the horizon, the barn grew quieter. The man had slept lightly, alert even in rest, his senses attuned to the land and the people around him. The widow watched him for a moment, contemplating the strange turn of fate that had brought him to her doorstep. She knew that his presence would change more than just this day. It would ripple through the lives of her daughters and hers in ways she could not yet see. But even as she thought this, a shadow of uncertainty passed over her mind. Who was he truly running from? What dangers trailed him across the plains? The questions hung in the air, unanswered and pressing, like the weight of the coming storm. A sudden sound outside, the scrape of a boot against wood, the soft whisper of movement made her stiffen. The girls sensed it too, holding their breath as the barn seemed to shrink around them. The man's head lifted instantly, his eyes sharp and calculating, scanning the doorway. The moment was tense, charged, as though the world itself had paused to see what would come next. "Stay close," the widow whispered to her daughters, though her voice betrayed the edge of fear she could not fully hide. The man rose to his feet, moving to the door with quiet, precise steps. His gaze swept the horizon, every muscle in his body alert, ready for whatever threat might appear. For a brief instant, he was no longer just a wounded traveler in need of help. He was a protector, a force honed by hardship, and the barn, the widow, and the girls were now caught within the orbit of his vigilance. He turned slightly, just enough for the widow to catch his eye. In that glance, there was a promise and a warning intertwined. He was grateful, yes, but there was more coming. Danger lingered beyond the walls of the barn, unseen but imminent. And when it came, it would not simply pass by. The widow swallowed hard, realizing that the act of saving him had shifted something fundamental. The plains outside remained quiet, the early morning light stretching across them, but nothing would remain the same after this night. Her daughters watched her, sensing the tension, the strange mixture of fear and anticipation that clung to the air. The man stepped back, his hand brushing against the rough wood of the barn doorway, and for a moment he seemed to consider the path that lay ahead. The widow understood, even without words, that this meeting was the beginning of something larger than any of them could imagine. Lives would intersect, choices would carry weight far beyond the immediate, and the fragile safety of the barn would soon be tested in ways they could not yet foresee. And then, without another word, he moved toward the edge of the property, pausing just long enough to ensure the girl's eyes followed him. There was a presence in him that demanded attention, a story yet to unfold, a battle yet to be faced. The wind swept across the plains once more, carrying a warning, a promise, and the faint echo of destiny beginning to stir. Inside the barn, the widow gathered the blankets, holding them close as the girls watched. Each of them understood, in the quiet language of survival, that their lives had been changed in a single night. The man outside had come into their world, and now the world beyond the barn would notice them in ways that had been impossible before. The sun climbed higher, gilding the edge of the horizon with light, yet the shadows of uncertainty lingered, stretching long and threatening. The widow felt it in her bones, in the way the air seemed to hum with expectation. The stranger they had saved was more than just a traveler. He was a force, and the plains themselves seemed to recognize the shift. No one spoke as the morning grew warmer. Each heart beat with a mixture of anticipation and unease, each mind turning toward the possibilities that lay just beyond the barn door. Outside, the lone Apache stood in the distance, a figure both vulnerable and indomitable, and the widow knew that the next moments would test every instinct, every decision, every ounce of courage they possessed. The wind picked up again, carrying dust and whispers across the field, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The widow clutched her daughters close, their small hands gripping hers, and for the first time since the stranger arrived, she allowed herself to wonder what fate had brought into their lives. The question lingered unanswered, and the moment stretched, fragile and electric, as the day began. They did not yet know the ways this meeting would change the course of their lives. They did not know the battles that awaited, the dangers that had followed him to their doorstep, or the strength that would be required of them all. But in that quiet dawn, under the watchful eyes of the plains and the first light of the morning, everything had already begun to shift, and nothing would ever be the same again. The widow looked toward the lone figure standing just beyond the barn, wind tugging at his hair and cloak, and felt a mixture of fear and hope she could not name. The plains stretched endlessly, and the horizon seemed to tremble with possibilities. And in the distance, faint and almost imperceptible, came the first sound of movement, something approaching, something unseen, yet very real, and she knew with a certainty that would not be shaken that this night's choice had set forces in motion that could not be undone. The story was no longer theirs alone. The wind shifted again, sharper this time, carrying a faint sound that set the widow's nerves on edge. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the tension coiling tighter with every second. The lone Apache stood motionless, his dark eyes scanning the far ridge as though reading a language only he could understand. The plains beyond the barn were open and empty, yet something about the air suggested that emptiness was deceptive. She tightened her grip on her daughter's hands, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down like the heavy heat of summer. "Mother," the older daughter whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you think they're coming?" The widow shook her head slowly, though her mind raced. "I don't know. But we need to be ready for anything." She gestured toward the barn's interior, where the tools and supplies could be arranged into makeshift defenses. Her daughters nodded, moving with a quiet obedience born of necessity. Years of surviving storms, harsh winters, and human cruelty had taught them both instinct and caution. Outside, the Apache's presence seemed to affect the land itself. Even the animals, crows circling overhead and a stray horse grazing at the edge of the property, paused, their movements tentative. There was an unspoken communication in the way he observed the horizon, a careful study of the winds and the distant ridges that suggested he had lived his life in constant vigilance. The widow could not tell if it was his skill or his experience, but it left her uneasy. He finally turned to look back at them, his gaze sharp yet distant. In that single glance, the widow saw both gratitude and a wariness that ran deeper than fear. He was not a man who trusted easily, and she had no illusions that he would reveal much of his story without reason. Yet something about the way he moved, the careful steadiness in his step, hinted at a past filled with battles, losses, and lessons learned the hard way. The younger daughter, curious despite the tension, edged closer to the doorway. Her small voice trembled. "Will he stay?" The widow hesitated. "I think so, for now. But I can't promise anything." She looked back toward the horizon, where the ridges blurred in the morning haze. Something felt off. The plains had a quiet that was too still, a watchfulness she could not name. The Apache spoke then, breaking the silence, his voice low and deliberate. "You saved me." "For a reason." The widow's brow furrowed. "I did what anyone would. Anyone with a heart." He shook his head slightly. "No, not anyone. You chose to trust, even without knowing me." There was a pause, a weight in his words. "Most would not. Most would have left me to die." Her mind flicked back to the hard years after her husband died, the loneliness that had pressed against her ribs like a stone. She had learned to act out of necessity, to see the value in courage and mercy, even when it carried risk. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "I have lived long enough to know what matters." He studied her for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly, and turned his attention back toward the plains. The widow realized she had glimpsed a fragment of his story, but only a fragment. There were truths he held close, secrets shaped by fear and survival. The girls hovered near the doorway, their curiosity mingled with caution. The older one finally found the courage to ask, "Are you really alone out here?" He did not answer immediately. His eyes lingered on the ridge, where the shadows played tricks with the morning light. "Alone?" He finally said, "No one is ever truly alone. Not in the way you mean, but yes, in the way that matters. I have walked many miles, and most of those I trusted are gone." The widow felt a pang of understanding. Loss and endurance were not strangers to her either. She had lost a husband, had fought to raise 2 daughters alone, and had seen neighbors leave or turn against one another. The world was a hard place, shaped by choice and chance. Yet, in this moment, she recognized that the man outside had endured far more than she could imagine. The wind rose again, carrying a subtle sound, a faint snapping, like a branch underfoot somewhere beyond the ridge. The Apache's body tensed, muscles coiling as if preparing to spring. His eyes narrowed, and the faint tilt of his head suggested he had detected something that had gone unnoticed by the widow and her daughters. "What is it?" the widow asked, her voice steady but her pulse quickening. He did not answer. Instead, he moved toward the barn door, silent as a shadow, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The girls instinctively stepped back, a shiver running down their spines. Even the animals seemed to sense the change. For a long moment, nothing happened. The plains remained calm in appearance, but tension hummed through the air like electricity. Then, a distant sound reached them, faint, yet deliberate. Footsteps, careful and measured, moving across the hard earth. Not random, not careless. Someone or something was approaching, and it was coming with intent. The widow's heart raced. She knew that their act of kindness, saving this lone man, had not gone unnoticed. The plains were full of eyes, of dangers hidden in shadow or waiting along the ridges, and now, whatever had followed him was close. The Apache shifted slightly, moving back into the barn, his presence commanding without a word. The widow realized that he had already begun assessing the threat, mentally preparing for what might come. His movements were precise, deliberate, every step calculated. There was no panic in him, only readiness born from experience. She nodded to her daughters, signaling them to stay close. The older girl understood immediately, gripping her mother's hand with a strength that belied her years. The younger one looked to the Apache, sensing the gravity of the moment, even if she did not understand the danger fully. The man finally spoke, his voice low and quiet, carrying a weight that made the widow shiver. "They are close. I feel it. Not just in sound, but in the land itself, they have tracked me. And they will not hesitate. The widow swallowed hard. Then we need to be ready. Whatever comes, we face it together. He nodded once, his dark eyes flicking to her and the girls, and for the first time, a small trace of something resembling trust passed between them. The connection was fragile, easily broken, but it existed. And in the world they inhabited, trust was a weapon as necessary as any blade. Hours seemed to stretch, the quiet before a storm. The sun rose higher, but the shadows lingered stubbornly along the edges of the barn and the ridges. The widow and her daughters moved carefully, arranging tools and supplies, while the Apache studied the horizon. His body remained tense, ready to react at the first sign of danger. As the morning wore on, fragments of his past began to emerge in quiet conversation. He spoke of lands far to the west, of battles fought with tribes both friend and foe, and of nights spent alone under the vast sky. The widow listened, sensing the depth of hardship he had endured, the loneliness that had shaped him, and the vigilance that had become second nature. The girls listened as well, absorbing the stories with a mixture of fear and fascination. They had never met someone who had walked such a hard path, who carried both courage and pain in equal measure. And though they did not fully grasp the details, they understood that their world had just expanded in ways they could not yet name. Suddenly, a bird took flight from the ridge, startlingly close, and the Apache's hand dropped instinctively to the hilt of a knife at his belt. His body moved with a speed and precision that left the widow breathless. He was a man shaped by necessity and danger, every movement honed by survival, every instinct sharpened by a life that demanded constant awareness. The widow felt a shiver of apprehension. The act of saving him had brought more than gratitude. It had drawn them all into a larger, more dangerous world. And though she could not yet see the full shape of the threat, she understood that it was real and imminent. The Apache spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "They are not far, and they will not wait. Whatever you have offered me, shelter, food, kindness, they will not respect. They will see it as weakness." The widow nodded, though fear pressed at her chest. "Then we will not give them weakness to find. We will be ready together." He studied her carefully, measuring not just her words but her resolve, and then he allowed a faint nod. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the wind and the distant rustle of grass. The air itself seemed to tighten, as if holding its breath for what was coming. The widow glanced at her daughters, their small hands gripping hers, and felt the weight of what she had done. This was no longer simply about helping a wounded traveler. It was about survival, about courage, about facing a threat that could come at any moment. And in that moment, she knew that their lives and the life of the man they had saved were irrevocably bound together. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint but unmistakable sound of movement along the ridge. The Apache stiffened, listening, scanning, ready to act. The widow's heart pounded. She had acted out of kindness, and now that kindness had brought them to the edge of something dangerous and unknown. The plains stretched endlessly beyond the barn, indifferent yet full of hidden threats. The sun climbed, casting light on the open land, but the shadows persisted stubbornly along the ridges and tree lines. The widow felt the tension pressing in from all sides, a reminder that the world beyond her small homestead was vast, unpredictable, and unforgiving. The man stepped closer to the doorway again, his figure framed by the morning light. His dark eyes swept the horizon, sharp and calculating, his every movement precise. He was no longer just a visitor. He was a guardian, a force shaped by survival and hardened by life. And the widow, standing with her daughters behind him, felt the full weight of what they had set in motion. The sound grew closer, a low murmur in the distance, yet deliberate, calculated, and unrelenting. Whatever had tracked him this far was now approaching, and there was no turning back. The barn, the homestead, and the lives within it were about to intersect with forces they could not yet see. The widow tightened her grip on her daughters, her eyes never leaving the ridge. The Apache, alert and ready, gave a subtle nod, acknowledging the imminent threat. The tension hung thick in the air, the calm before a storm that promised to test every ounce of courage they possessed. No words were spoken for a long moment. Each heart beat in anticipation, each mind racing through possibilities. The wind carried the faint sound of movement again, and the shadow on the horizon seemed to grow larger, darker, more certain. Inside the barn, the widow, her daughters, and the lone Apache waited, bound together by a single act of courage that had shifted the course of all their lives. And outside, the plains held their secrets, waiting for the moment when patience would end and the coming reckoning would begin. The moment stretched, fragile and electric. As the ridge finally gave a hint of motion, something approaching, unseen yet unmistakably alive, a presence that would change everything if it crossed the homestead's threshold. The sound of footsteps grew louder, faint at first, then sharper, echoing across the dry earth with a rhythm that set the widow's nerves on edge. She pressed herself against the wall of the barn, one arm around her younger daughter, while the older one clutched the side of the doorway, peeking cautiously. The lone Apache moved with quiet precision, scanning the horizon, muscles coiled, ready to act at the first sign of trouble. His gaze flicked to the shadows where the barn's corners met the floor, noting every small detail. He was not only aware of the approaching threat, he was preparing for it in ways that the widow and her daughters could not yet comprehend. From the ridge, a group appeared, moving cautiously but deliberately. Their silhouettes were small but unmistakable, and there was a pattern to their steps that suggested organization and intent. The widow felt her pulse quicken. Whoever they were, they had come for him, and now she and her daughters were caught in the middle. She looked to the Apache, searching his expression for some clue, some plan, but all she saw was readiness, a steel-like patience born from countless encounters with danger. "They're scouts," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Testing the ground, seeing what they can take without risk." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that betrayed the weight of his experience. "We cannot wait for them to act. We must prepare." The widow nodded, her mind racing. She had tools, farm implements, and supplies, but she knew that nothing ordinary could stand against a determined group. Yet she trusted the Apache's judgment. He had survived the wilds and enemies she could barely imagine, and now his knowledge had become their shield. She turned to the girls. "Stay low. Do not make noise. Follow every move I make." The older daughter nodded, understanding the gravity without needing further explanation. She glanced at the younger one, who clutched her mother's dress tightly, eyes wide with fear and curiosity. The Apache moved to a corner, scanning the barn and the surrounding field, marking weak points, estimating escape routes, and silently calculating the odds. The widow could feel the tension vibrating off him. He was not a man who wasted thought. Every second, every movement had purpose. From the ridge, the scouts seemed to hesitate, and the widow could sense the momentary pause in their advance. The wind shifted again, carrying the sound of distant birds startled into flight, and the Apache's head snapped up. His eyes narrowed, trained to notice even the smallest change in the landscape. "They have signals," he said, "signs that they are not alone. Someone guides them." A chill ran through her, even in the growing warmth of the morning sun. She had not realized how isolated the homestead was until now, nor how vulnerable it had made them. She pressed her daughters closer, sensing the danger closing in from more than one angle. "Signals?" the older girl whispered, barely audibly. "Means someone watches from beyond what we can see," the Apache replied. "They are not wandering. They are hunting." The widow's heart sank. It was one thing to survive the wilds or a storm, another to survive calculated threats from people or creatures that moved with purpose and secrecy. And yet, For all the fear pressing against her, she found a stubborn defiance rising in her chest. She had raised 2 daughters alone. She had endured cold winters, loss, and hardship. She would not let them be taken without a fight. The sound of movement shifted again, now closer to the barn itself. The widow tightened her grip, whispering for the girls to stay calm. The Apache stepped forward, glancing back at her, his hand brushing against the hilt of a knife. His gaze was steady, but she could see the tension beneath the surface, the readiness for violence that came only from experience. "They will test the walls first," he said, "probes, looking for weakness. We cannot show them what we have, or they will take it." The widow understood instinctively. They had to appear ordinary, defenseless, but that was a trap. The Apache was planning something beyond their immediate perception, a counter that required patience and calculation. She moved silently, gathering tools that could serve as both distraction and defense, placing them strategically in corners and along the barn's door frame. Her daughters watched and mimicked her, hands steady despite the fear. The scouts were closer now, and the widow could see the sharp edges of their movement, the careful attention they paid to the ridge and the barn. They were not reckless, but every motion betrayed intent. They were hunting not just for the Apache, but for any advantage they could exploit. And yet, the Apache remained calm, his presence a quiet reassurance that there was a strategy unfolding even if she could not fully understand it. Hours passed, though they seemed like minutes. The sun climbed higher, shadows shifting across the plains. The widow's mind raced with possibilities. Who were these people? How far would they go to capture him? And what had he done or been involved in that had made him a target? Her daughters spoke little, but their silence carried the weight of observation. They had learned from their mother to notice details others overlooked, and now every small sound, every movement of the wind seemed charged with meaning. They began to whisper quietly to each other, forming small observations that added to the picture forming in the widow's mind. The Apache finally broke the silence. "They will not give up quickly. They are patient, and they are skilled. We must be ready for more than simple tests." His voice was low, a warning and a promise. "This is no ordinary threat. We are dealing with people who understand danger as deeply as I do. They are not to be underestimated." The widow felt a chill. Her life had been hard, but this was something beyond the ordinary. And yet, despite the fear, she could not turn away. The man had come into her life through need, and now that need had entangled them all. She tightened her grip on the tools in her hands, feeling the weight of responsibility and the rising sense of determination. The ridge shimmered in the heat of the late morning, and a sudden movement caught her eye. A figure detached itself from the shadows, smaller than the scouts but deliberate in its steps. The Apache stiffened immediately, recognizing something she could not yet name. "An advance," he whispered. "Watching, waiting." The widow's heart raced. Every instinct in her body screamed danger, yet she stayed rooted, trusting the man who had survived what she could not even imagine. Her daughters remained close, silent, and attentive. Even the animals had retreated into corners of the barn, sensing the shift in the air. "They are not just scouts," the Apache said. "They are looking for weakness, for fear, and they will exploit it." The widow nodded slowly, understanding the stakes. Her life, her daughters, and the Apache's safety were intertwined in ways that had never existed before. Every decision, every movement, every whispered sound mattered. The threat was not immediate yet, but it was inevitable. From another ridge, a faint glimmer of light reflected off metal. A weapon? A signal? She could not tell, but the Apache noticed instantly a sharp intake of breath, a tightening of muscles. "They are signaling," he said. "Someone beyond the horizon is guiding them. This is bigger than a simple pursuit. Much bigger." The widow felt the tension coiling tighter, a sense of something larger pressing against the edges of their world. Questions raced through her mind. Who were these people? How many were there? And most importantly, what did the Apache carrier know that had drawn such precise attention? The Apache did not answer immediately, instead moving silently to the barn door, scanning the horizon, his presence commanding even in the still air. His dark eyes seemed to pierce the distance, anticipating the movements of unseen enemies, calculating every risk, every possibility. She could see his mind working, plotting, preparing. She realized that his story was not just about survival. It was about strategy, about reading people, terrain, and circumstances in ways most could not even imagine. The widow's daughters whispered again, their voices tense but curious. "Mother, do you think they'll come here?" "They will try," she replied softly, "but we are not alone. We have him." She gestured toward the Apache, who was watching the ridge with unwavering attention. Her heart sank at the thought of what was coming, yet there was also a strange sense of hope. He was dangerous, yes, but in the way that protected those who trusted him. The minutes stretched into hours. The ridge remained restless, shadows flickering, shapes moving too deliberately to be natural. The Apache remained alert, his stance tense, yet measured. He had survived far worse than a few approaching figures. The widow felt the weight of their lives pressing together, the small homestead now the center of a silent, invisible war. A sudden cry echoed faintly from the far edge of the field. Birds erupted into the sky, startled by the noise. The Apache's body went rigid, eyes flashing toward the sound. "They are testing us," he said quietly, listening, looking for the smallest crack. The widow's pulse quickened. She understood now that the act of saving him had drawn this danger directly to her door. Her mind raced through every possible plan, every scenario she had learned from hard years of survival. And yet, for all her preparation, she knew she was not the one making the crucial choices. That responsibility lay with him, the lone man who had appeared at their doorstep, weary and wounded, yet alive with a vigilance born of a lifetime on the run. The younger daughter whispered, "Mother, what if they take him?" The widow's chest tightened. She did not answer immediately, knowing that fear must be tempered with clarity. "We cannot let that happen," she said finally. "Not if we want to survive this." The Apache's gaze shifted to the girls, then back to the ridge. "They will not give up. But we can choose when and how to fight. The first strike is not ours to make. Yet." The widow nodded slowly, realizing that the coming hours would test them all. The Apache's presence was a shield, a force, and a mystery all at once. And the scouts, whoever they were the spark that threatened to ignite a confrontation that could change everything. Shadows lengthened as the day wore on, the sun climbing higher and then dipping slightly as the afternoon approached. The ridge remained active, shapes moving subtly but with purpose. The widow felt the pressure of anticipation in every nerve, every glance, every heartbeat. This was not a fight that could be avoided. It was a storm waiting to strike, and she, her daughters, and the lone Apache were standing in the center of it. A sudden rustle from behind the barn made her spin, heart pounding. A deer? A coyote? She could not tell. But the Apache was already moving, positioning himself between the noise and the girls, ready to act with a speed and precision that left her breathless. "They are everywhere," he said quietly, almost to himself, "and yet they cannot see all of us." The widow understood the meaning. They were invisible in some ways, hidden, protected by skill, knowledge, and courage. And yet the threat was real, pressing closer with every passing moment. She gathered her daughters close, feeling the tension coiling tighter. The plains stretched endlessly beyond them, deceptively calm, yet every shadow and whisper suggested movement, presence, and intent. She realized that saving the Apache had bound them to a larger story, one of danger, pursuit, and a coming reckoning that none of them could yet predict. The wind shifted again, carrying distant sounds that were unmistakably deliberate. The scouts were advancing, guided by something or someone beyond the visible horizon. The Apache's muscles tensed, his eyes scanning, mind calculating. The widow felt a shiver of anticipation and fear. The moment of confrontation was approaching, though neither she nor her daughters fully understood its form. They waited, the barn a fragile sanctuary against the plains and the ridge beyond. The lone Apache stood as a sentinel, a protector, and a mystery all at once. And outside, the shadows moved, deliberate and patient, closing the gap, bringing the invisible threat closer with each heartbeat. The widow knew, with the certainty of survival instincts honed over years, that this night, this day, had changed everything. The Apache's world had intersected with hers in a way that could not be undone, and the approaching danger promised to push them all beyond the limits they had known. No one spoke for a long moment. Every sound, every movement, every breath was amplified by anticipation. The ridge remained restless, shapes flickering, signals passing between them. The wind carried warnings, whispers, and the faintest hints of what was coming. The widow tightened her grip on her daughters, her heart pounding. The Apache shifted slightly, ready to act at the first sign. Outside, the scouts drew closer, deliberate and patient, their presence undeniable, their intent clear. And the plains waited, silent yet charged, holding the promise of a confrontation that could change everything. Time seemed to stretch, fragile and electric. The widow, her daughters, and the lone Apache waited, knowing that the first move would set a course none of them could reverse. And beyond the ridge, in the hidden folds of the plains, the approaching threat moved closer, invisible yet tangible, carrying with it questions that demanded answers the moment had not yet arrived to provide. The moment was thick with anticipation, the calm before a storm that promised to test courage, skill, and the bonds formed in a single act of compassion. The widow felt the weight of her choice pressing against her, the life of the man she had saved intertwined with her own and that of her daughters. The ridge held secrets, shadows, and watchers unseen. And the day, though bright, carried the first hints of danger that would not wait. The Apache's eyes, dark and sharp, scanned the ridge once more. "They are patient," he said quietly. "But patience has limits. Soon they will act. And when they do, we must be ready." The widow swallowed hard, nodding. Her daughters clung to her, small hands trembling but steady. Outside, the shadows stretched, the shape shifted, and the air itself seemed to hum with tension. The moment had arrived when waiting alone would not be enough. They were bound to a story larger than themselves, and the plains, silent yet alive, waited for the first spark to ignite a chain of events none of them could yet foresee. The day grew heavier, the sun burning higher and casting harsh light across the dry plains. Yet the ridge remained restless. Every movement beyond the barn seemed deliberate, calculated, as though the very land itself were conspiring with forces unseen. The widow's heart thumped in her chest, each beat echoing the tension that hung thick in the air. Her daughters huddled close, whispering in small breaths, and the lone Apache moved between them, silent, alert, a living shield against threats only he could sense in their fullness. The ridge began to shift again, faint glimmers of motion tracing the distant line where earth met sky. The widow's pulse quickened. Whoever or whatever was coming had patience, skill, and intent. They were not wandering, not lost, not distracted. They were coming for him, for the man whose presence had brought both danger and a strange sense of hope into their lives. The Apache's eyes scanned the horizon, muscles coiled, every movement deliberate, every breath measured. He had lived through moments like this before, moments that could turn a life upside down in a heartbeat, and his vigilance reflected years of survival and instinct. "They are close," he whispered, almost to himself, but the widow caught the words. His voice carried authority, even when low, a silent command that demanded attention. Too close to wait, too smart to be random. The widow glanced at her daughters, their small faces pale but focused. She could see their understanding, the way fear had sharpened their instincts. This was no longer a matter of observation. This was a matter of preparation. Every tool, every piece of wood or rope in the barn became part of a makeshift defense, yet she knew that what was coming could not be countered by ordinary means. From the ridge came the faintest flicker of movement, a shadow that separated from the others, careful but deliberate. The Apache stiffened, his body moving with a precision that left no doubt he was assessing the threat, calculating the danger, ready to act. "Advance," he said quietly, eyes narrowing. "They are testing us, measuring courage, fear, hesitation. And they will exploit whatever they find." The widow's stomach tightened. She understood the meaning instinctively. This was not a simple confrontation. It was a trial, a test, a deliberate push against every instinct she and her daughters had learned in years of survival. And the man at their side was not simply a stranger. He was a force of skill, awareness, and experience, tempered by a life that had demanded vigilance beyond ordinary imagination. The sound of footsteps shifted again, closer this time, almost imperceptibly blending with the wind and the rustle of dry grass. The widow's pulse raced. Her daughters flinched at every faint snap or brush of sound, their small hands gripping hers. The Apache's dark eyes swept the ridge and the plains beyond, noting every shadow, every curve of the land, every glimmer that might signal danger. "They are watching," he said quietly. "Every step, every glance, every hesitation is noted. They will come closer. They will strike when the moment is right." The widow swallowed hard. She could feel the truth of it in her bones. Whoever approached was patient, organized, and ruthless. And yet, despite the fear pressing against her chest, a stubborn determination rose within her. She had saved him. She had taken a chance on compassion, and now she would see it through, whatever the cost. The ridge shimmered in the heat, and a distant glint caught her eye. Metal, perhaps, or sunlight reflecting off something sharp. The Apache noticed instantly, his stance tightening. "They signal each other," he said. "Someone guides them. It is bigger than a hunt. Much bigger." A cold sense of unease settled over her. She realized the danger had grown beyond the horizon, beyond the ridge, beyond what they could see. And yet, for all the fear, she saw in the Apache a spark of hope, a preparedness that promised protection if they trusted him. She pressed her daughters close, silent but ready. The sound of distant voices reached them faintly, carried by the wind. Low, deliberate, strategic. The widow could not understand the words, but the intent was unmistakable. They were coordinating. They were closing in. She glanced at the Apache. "How many do you think?" He did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the ridge, scanning, calculating. "Enough to force a choice," he said finally. "Enough to test every skill we have. But not more than we can handle if we act as one." The widow's heart pounded. She had raised her daughters to survive storms, to endure hardship, to be strong in ways small children rarely needed to be. And now that training would be tested in ways she could not yet foresee. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders, knowing that one wrong move could have consequences far beyond the barn, far beyond the ridge, far beyond their understanding. A sudden flicker of motion, a shadow detached itself from the ridge, approaching with careful steps, made her flinch. The Apache moved instantly, stepping in front of them, a silent wall of readiness. His dark eyes were sharp, calculating every possibility, every risk, every advantage. He was prepared to act, and his presence gave the widow a strange sense of both fear and relief. "They probe," he whispered, "watching for fear, testing the threshold. They will exploit anything they sense." The widow nodded, her mind racing. She arranged the barn's interior, shifting supplies, positioning tools in a way that could serve as distractions or obstacles. Every movement was deliberate, yet she knew it was not enough to hold back what approached. The Apache's presence was the real shield, his skill the true advantage. And yet, the unknown beyond the ridge remained a threat, unpredictable and patient. Time stretched, taut and fragile. The ridge trembled faintly with movement, distant and deliberate, and the widow could feel the tension tightening in her chest. Her daughters whispered occasionally, small voices trembling but attentive, noting every sound, every shadow, every change in the wind. They understood, instinctively, that this was not simply a test of strength, but of vigilance, courage, and quick thinking. The Apache stepped closer to the barn doorway, hand resting on the hilt of his knife, eyes sweeping the horizon. His muscles coiled like a spring, ready to react at the slightest provocation. "They will act soon," he said quietly. "The first strike will come before we expect it, and the moment will define everything." The widow's chest tightened. She realized that what had started as a simple act of kindness, saving a wounded man, had grown into a situation that could engulf them all. Every choice, every second, every breath carried weight beyond measure. The ridge remained restless, shadows flickering, distant movements deliberate and patient. Suddenly, a low sound carried across the field. Not a voice, not a step, but a signal, subtle and deliberate. The Apache stiffened instantly. "They move now," he whispered. "They test the limits. Watch the horizon. Be ready." Her daughters clutched her arms, their small hands trembling but firm. She nodded, her own pulse racing. Every nerve in her body screamed readiness, awareness, and the need to act. The ridge held unseen watchers, the plains stretched endlessly, and yet within the barn, they had a chance to face what was coming together. The wind shifted again, carrying the faintest flicker of sound, the slightest change in pressure that spoke to experience only he possessed. The Apache's eyes narrowed, muscles coiling, every motion precise. He had survived ambushes, attacks, and relentless pursuit. The widow realized that his story was not just of survival but of calculation, awareness, and skill beyond anything she had known. From the ridge, faint glimmers of movement traced the approach of the scouts. Each step deliberate, each shadow purposeful. They were closing in, yet they had not yet revealed their full strength. The widow felt a chill. Whoever they were, they had patience, organization, and intent. And now that the Apache had entered her world, the stakes were higher than they could have imagined. The Apache turned briefly to the widow, eyes dark and calculating. "We must choose the moment," he said quietly. "Patience can be strength, but timing will decide whether we stand or fall." Her pulse quickened. She understood instinctively that this was more than just survival, it was strategy, a test of courage and a lesson in trust. She pressed her daughters closer, whispering reassurance that her own heart did not fully feel. The ridge shimmered with subtle motion, the plains carried a quiet tension, and the approaching threat remained unseen but undeniably present. Minutes stretched like hours. The widow, her daughters, and the Apache waited, every sense sharpened, every movement deliberate. The ridge remained restless, shadows flickering, and the wind carried the faintest signs of intent. Then a sharp sound of snapped branch, deliberate and close, made them all tense. The Apache moved instantly, stepping in front of the girls, eyes scanning, ready to act. His presence was both a shield and a statement. He was not merely a man in need, he was a force of skill, awareness, and experience, and they were under his protection. The widow swallowed hard, realizing that the choice to save him had brought them to the edge of a storm. The ridge trembled with movement, shadows shifted with intent, and the first spark of confrontation was about to ignite. Every nerve, every instinct, every heartbeat demanded attention. Her daughters whispered, small voices trembling with anticipation. "Mother, what happens now?" The widow's eyes never left the ridge. "Now," she said quietly, "we wait, and we fight if we must, but the moment to act is coming." The Apache's gaze swept the horizon one last time, dark eyes sharp and calculating. "Soon," he said. The first move will come, and everything will change. Be ready. The wind rose again, carrying the faintest sound of movement, deliberate, unseen, approaching. The barn, the homestead, and the lives within it hung on the edge of tension, the calm before the storm. The ridge shimmered, shadows shifted, and the plains held their breath. The widow pressed her daughters close, feeling the weight of what had begun, knowing that the moment of reckoning was near. The Apache stood sentinel, alert and silent, every sense focused on the horizon. And beyond, the scouts advanced, patient, deliberate, and unstoppable, carrying with them the promise of conflict, danger, and a climax none of them could yet see. Every heartbeat, every flicker of movement, every whisper of wind built the tension to its peak. The ridge held watchers, the plains stretched endlessly, and the barn remained their fragile sanctuary. The first confrontation was imminent, and with it, the choices they had made, the courage they had summoned, and the trust they had placed in one another would be tested in ways they could not yet imagine. Time slowed as the shadows approached, deliberate, patient, inevitable. The widow, her daughters, and the lone Apache waited, hearts pounding, every sense alert. Outside, the ridge shimmered, movement precise, the unseen threat pressing closer with every second. The moment was at hand, the tension unbearable, the stakes higher than any of them could have foreseen. The first spark would fall soon, and with it, everything would be set into motion. The plains, the ridge, the barn, and the lives within it were poised on the edge of the unknown, waiting for the storm that would determine courage, survival, and the possibility of hope. The tension broke like a snapped rope, sudden and sharp. The first figure stepped into the open, a scout who had tested the perimeter, and before any thought could turn to panic, the Apache acted. He moved with precision born of years in the wild, intercepting the man with a sweep of his arm and a careful push that sent the scout sprawling into the dry grass. The others froze, startled by the speed and control, and the widow felt her chest lift with a mix of fear and relief. "They will not harm us," the Apache said quietly, eyes still scanning the horizon. His voice carried the authority of someone who had faced impossible odds and survived. "They underestimate what they do not see." The scouts hesitated, uncertain, and the widow realized the advantage. The Apache's presence was more than protection. It was strategy, patience, and understanding. He did not strike recklessly. Every movement was deliberate, designed to control, to prevent harm, to neutralize threat without unnecessary violence. The widow moved beside her daughters, whispering reassurance. "See? Courage and calm are stronger than fear." She glanced at the Apache, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. He had saved them as much as they had saved him, though she understood now it was not a simple act. It was a bond forged through risk, trust, and shared purpose. The scouts finally broke, retreating toward the ridge, their approach thwarted, their confidence shaken. The Apache did not pursue. He knew the land, knew patience, and knew that the threat had been tested and neutralized for now. Relief washed over the widow and her daughters, yet the moment was fragile. "What now?" the older daughter asked softly, still clutching her mother's arm. "We wait," the Apache replied, voice calm but firm. "And we learn. They will not give up forever, but we have the advantage now. Knowledge, vigilance, and courage are ours." The widow nodded. She felt the weight of days past, the loneliness and fear that had pressed against her chest, begin to lift. She had faced storms before, but nothing like this. She had seen bravery in her daughters, resilience in herself, and skill beyond measure in the man they had saved. It was a revelation in human strength and trust. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, the widow and her daughters moved to secure the barn, restoring calm while keeping the lessons of vigilance alive. Every corner was checked, every tool returned to its place, yet the sense of readiness remained. The Apache watched, alert but relaxed, signaling that the danger had passed for now. He finally turned to the widow, eyes softening in a rare moment. "You chose to help me," he said. "Not out of fear, not out of obligation, but because you saw what was right. That is rare." The widow's lips curved in a small smile. "Perhaps the world is not entirely harsh," she replied. "Sometimes courage and kindness carry more weight than we imagine." Her daughters echoed the sentiment, their small voices carrying pride and wonder. They had witnessed bravery, strategy, and survival in ways they could not have anticipated, and the experience had shaped them. They had learned that even in fear, decisions mattered, and trust was a gift that could change lives. Night began to settle, the sky painted in hues of orange and violet. The plains stretched endlessly, calm now but carrying memories of tension and near conflict. The widow and her daughters gathered near the fire she had built, the Apache sitting close, a watchful presence even in calm. Conversation was quiet, reflective, filled with moments of laughter and small smiles that marked the easing of tension. "Will they return?" the younger daughter asked, eyes wide with curiosity. "Perhaps," the Apache said, shaking his head slightly. "But we will be ready. And more importantly, we know how to watch, how to act, how to survive." The widow nodded. Survival had always been part of their lives, but now it was deeper, connected with courage, strategy, and the understanding that trust and compassion could shape outcomes as much as skill or strength. She felt a strange sense of completeness, as if a chapter had ended not with destruction, but with lessons learned and bonds formed. In the quiet that followed, the widow observed the Apache more closely. He had been silent often, measured in speech, and yet every word carried meaning. She realized that his world, once solitary and burdened by loss, had shifted because of her choice. He had entered a place of trust, safety, and connection he had not known in years. And in doing so, he had offered protection and guidance in return, creating a balance that bound them all. The older daughter leaned against her mother, voice small but reflective. "He's not like anyone I've ever met," she said. "Neither are you," her mother replied softly. "And we have learned from each other." The younger daughter, still watching the Apache, whispered, "Do you think he will stay?" The widow smiled faintly. "I think he has found a place where he is needed, and a reason to stay. Sometimes that is enough." The Apache looked up at them then, a small, almost imperceptible smile crossing his face. It was rare, fleeting, but it held a promise of trust and quiet connection. For the first time in a long while he felt a sense of peace, a recognition that the world beyond the ridge could hold more than danger, it could hold choices, trust, and unexpected friendship. As night deepened, the fire crackled softly, a steady warmth against the cool air. The widow and her daughters settled near it, talking in hushed tones, their minds still alert but no longer gripped by fear. Outside, the plain stretched calm, the ridge still but alive with memory, and the wind carried a quiet whisper of the events that had passed. The Apache finally spoke, voice quiet but thoughtful. "The world is not always kind, but kindness changes things. It can save lives, it can shape futures, it can change a world." The widow nodded, watching her daughter's small faces illuminated by the firelight. "We have learned that," she said, "and we will carry it forward." The moments passed into night fully, stars twinkling above, a vast canvas of calm after a day of tension. The plain seemed peaceful, the ridge silent, yet the memory of danger lingered as a reminder. They had faced fear, uncertainty, and deliberate threat, and yet they had emerged not broken but stronger. The widow felt a quiet pride, not just in herself but in her daughters and in the man they had saved. He had shown skill, courage, and trust in ways that allowed them to survive. They had shown kindness, intuition, and determination that had shifted his world. And together, they had forged bonds stronger than the threat that had sought to undo them. Morning approached slowly, soft and calm. The Apache stood at the edge of the barn, watching the plains, yet his stance was relaxed, measured, confident. He had survived danger, yes, but he had also discovered something he had not known he needed: connection, trust, and a place to rest without fear. The widow emerged from the barn, daughters in tow. They moved quietly across the yard, checking the fence, tending the small garden, and taking care of the animals. Life continued, ordinary and simple, yet charged with meaning. They had endured the storm, faced danger, and found strength in each other. The Apache followed, not behind, but beside them, a quiet presence that spoke volumes. They did not need words to understand the bond that had formed. He had entered their lives as a stranger in need, yet he had become a protector, a friend, and something more, a living testament to courage, patience, and trust. The widow smiled faintly, watching her daughters, feeling the calm settle. The ridge remained in the distance, but its shadows no longer carried threat, only memory. The plains stretched endlessly, now quiet, carrying the lessons of yesterday and the promise of tomorrow. In the days that followed, the small homestead grew stronger. The Apache helped with chores, repaired fences, and taught the girls skills they had not known, blending wisdom with patience. The widow felt a deep sense of relief and hope, knowing that the man they had saved was not only part of their survival but a force that enriched their lives. Evenings were filled with quiet conversation, laughter, and stories shared by firelight. The danger of the ridge remained a distant memory, a lesson etched into their understanding, but it no longer loomed with fear. They had faced it together, endured it, and emerged stronger. The older daughter began to smile more freely. The younger one laughed without fear, and the widow finally felt a sense of peace she had not known since her husband's death. The Apache had become more than a protector. He had become a part of their family, a bridge between the past and the future, and a reminder that even in the hardest times, courage and kindness could change a world. Weeks passed, the plains calm and forgiving. The widow watched the Apache help her daughters practice skills, teaching them patience, focus, and resilience. She realized that the danger had been a turning point, not an end, and that the lessons learned would carry forward in ways they could not yet measure. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a brilliant orange, the widow and the Apache stood together on the small rise behind the barn. The daughters played nearby, laughter carrying across the quiet fields. He looked at her, eyes reflecting both gratitude and a quiet sense of belonging. "You changed my world," he said softly. "And you changed ours," the widow replied. "We found strength we did not know we had, and you reminded us of courage, trust, and hope." The Apache nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Sometimes it takes being lost to be found." By the right people. The widow's daughters ran to them, their small hands in theirs, laughter mingling with the soft evening air. For the first time in a long while, the Apache felt at home, not just in the land, but with people who had chosen trust over fear, courage over hesitation, and connection over solitude. The plains stretched endlessly before them, calm and forgiving, carrying the promise of life, hope, and growth. The ridge, once a symbol of looming danger, had become part of the past, a memory that reminded them of courage tested and bonds forged. The widow looked at her daughters, then at the Apache, and felt a warmth in her chest she had not thought possible. Life was simple again, yet it carried depth, meaning, and the satisfaction of overcoming fear and finding family in unexpected ways. Night fell fully, stars twinkling above, and the fire crackled softly. The world was quiet, alive, and waiting for tomorrow. They had endured, they had learned, and they had found hope. The lone Apache, once wandering and hunted, had found shelter, trust, and a family. The widow and her daughters had found courage, connection, and a protector who would never leave their side. Together, they watched the night sky, knowing that danger could return, but also knowing that they had the strength, skill, and trust to face whatever came. And in that moment, beneath the endless stars and the calm plains, they understood the greatest truth of all: courage. Kindness and trust could change a world, and even in the harshest land, a family could be found in the most unexpected places. The widow held her daughters close, the Apache at her side, and for the first time in a long time, the world felt full of promise. Their lives had been tested, danger had been faced, and yet they had emerged stronger, bound together by choice, bravery, and compassion. The plains were quiet, the ridge distant, and the barn stood as a home not just of shelter, but of trust, courage, and new beginnings. In that quiet, under the stars, they all knew one thing with certainty: the act of saving, the choice to trust, and the courage to face fear together had changed everything. And from that day forward, the widow, her daughters, and the lone Apache faced life not just with survival, but with hope, resilience, and the unshakable knowledge that they were stronger together than apart. The night held them in a calm embrace, the plains peaceful, and the fire casting a gentle glow on their faces. The dangers of yesterday were behind them, lessons learned, fears faced, and the bonds of trust and courage now unbreakable. Life had returned to its ordinary rhythm, yet it carried depth, meaning, and the quiet joy of survival, connection, and new beginnings. The widow whispered to her daughters as they lay near the fire, "We are safe now, and we will always find our way." The Apache, kneeling beside them, nodded. "And whatever comes, we face it together." The stars above twinkled endlessly, the plains stretching wide and calm, and for the first time in many moons, the world seemed gentle, promising, and full of life. They had endured, they had learned, and in the quiet aftermath, they had discovered what mattered most: courage, trust, and the unbreakable bond of family. The wind stirred softly, carrying the faint sun of the earth, and the widow felt a deep sense of peace. The Apache had found a home, the daughters had found safety, and she had found hope renewed. Together, they faced the future, hearts full, ready for whatever life might bring, knowing that even in the wildest plains, kindness, courage, and trust could transform lives forever. The fire flickered low, the stars shone bright, and the barn, once a refuge from fear, now stood as a symbol of strength, connection, and the power of a single act of compassion. And beneath the vast sky, with the plains stretching endlessly, they closed their eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring promise, safety, and the quiet joy of lives forever changed for the better.